So let me start with introducing Ringu Tulku Rinpoche, who is the abbot of Ringu Monastery in Kham, and also the founder and head of Bodhicharya International. He studied at the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology in Sikkim and also Sanskrit University. He has a great interest in translation. He taught Tibetan as a translation group while he was at Naropa. I was a beneficiary of that. It was quite wonderful. And he also translates for His Holiness the 17th Karmapa at the Kagyu Munlam each year and at conferences. He travels and teaches widely at Kagyu centers throughout the world and has numerous books, including the Rime Philosophy of Jomen Control. So welcome, Ringu Tulku. And the question we want to pick up for you is about the threefold process of transmission, Wang, Tri, and Lung. And in particular, yesterday we were talking about the it of translation, what gets translated. In this case, what is the it that gets transmitted, and how is that changing in the contemporary era?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and everybody for this conference. I'm very moved to see not only many translators and scholars, but also that how much there is dedication and understanding of the Dharma. And that I feel that maybe we are going through the golden age of translation into English languages, because so many things are going on in translation these days. And I'm extremely happy. About the subject, I feel that when we are talking about transmission at this point, about the Dharma, I think we are talking about Dharma. And Dharma, what is transmitted, I think, is Dharma. And Dharma is, I think, is transformation. Transformation of ourselves. And usually when we explain Dharma, we always talk about Lung and Tokpa, and the experience of the Dharma, which you can also say enlightened experience or whatever. And the words, or the you can say words maybe, but the means through which that experience is expressed. So these are the two, Lung and Tokpa, what is the medium through which this transmission happens. So when we talk about the traditionally three ways, Lung, Tit, and Wang. The Lung, I think, is actually goes the same meaning as this, the words. Or the another way of maybe Lung is authentic kind of words, authentic way of expressing that experience of transformation. And that, it's oral transmission also, and it can be text also. Because I think, as he was pointing out in the morning, the Lung was very important in the beginning. Because especially when the time the texts were not written down. And I think there was a long time when texts were not written down. And especially like in the Indian tradition, it was at a certain time, and maybe even now a little bit, considered not good. It's not right to write down the texts. Maybe different reasons for it, but so that time, then somebody has to say the words, and then the students had to memorize it and things like that. I think that time it was very, very important, the lung. Later on, after the text of the authentic words of Dhamma was written down, I think even then it was very important, because that time it was not printed. So the texts were very, very scarce, and it was very difficult to get the texts. As I remember, even when I was first, in India, when we were refugees and was trying to study, we didn't have texts, and there was no photocopy, and there was no, any kind of, camera, anything. So only way, if somebody had a text, we just, sometimes stole. And sometimes borrowed and never returned. I remember that when Chujam Trungpa came from India to England, he borrowed, the whole text of Shezhanzhe from somebody and left. So it was very difficult, and that's why I'm so grateful to the, now this digitalizing and all these things. But anyway, that's not the point here. I want to be very short. So therefore you have to be given the text, and then you have to, read it, or you have to copy it and things like that. So there's transmission. And now it's not exactly the same. Now, of course, there are lots of texts are available and things like that. But I think it's like it's still relevant, because there is it establishes a relationship between the teacher and the student, and it's a little bit like like for instance, I feel like this that. You have there is a student who is who studied lots of things, maybe about like say Uma, Madhyamika. So he knows the subject, but there is a text which he hasn't studied. So now the teacher might just give a lung, and then now you can study on your own, and then if you have some questions you can ask me or something like that. So the transmission is given. And so therefore it's like, in that matters, I think it's still very, very, very relevant. It's a very relevant thing, because it's not just like you make up things, because from the Buddhist point of view, and especially in the Tibetan, we say that you should not, the kala rechu. I know that this word is difficult to translate, but you kind of, you try to interpret without knowing it. Is regarded very bad. You kind of you kind of yourself, without any transmission or any receiving any teachings on it, just try to explain something, and you might got it totally wrong, or things like that. So that's we call the kala rechu. And so that is considered very bad. So therefore, it's there's a kind of building, some kind of a bond, or trust between the teacher and the student. That's the lung. But of course, this the lung, how it is given. I mean, there are some questions whether it should be given in the original language or the language it's translated. I feel it should be given in the language translated, because in Tibet they did like that. It was translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan, and the Long was given by the translator, to the other people, and that's how the transmission happened. And this, I don't need, maybe I don't need to say it, but the Karmapa did it the same way. Like he made a small text and then he translated it into different languages and gave the Long in different languages, already like that. Then we go to the Te, and that's the explanation. Of course, there are different types of explanations, because there is a kind of word by word translation explanations. There is a kind of explanation of difficult points, or explanation till like Martit, which is like experiential explanations. Then Dhamma and all these different types of or with sometimes Genmun Sutsu, like old ladies finger pointing kind of instructions. All this kind of is a transmission, and these transmissions is actually it's like it's making the other person understand. I think it's all about that, and I feel translation is also a transmission. I think we translate, like not only in different languages. I think we translate in our own language also. Like if there is a poem or something like that, and you don't understand it, and then you try to explain it in a language that the people will understand. You might use slang, you might use colloquial, you might use whatever language, body language, you might use e-language or whatever, So that is, you're translating that in a way that is understood by the people. And the transmission is, I think, like that. It's something that you experience, you understand, that you kind of explain it or by any means make it experienced by somebody else. I think that's transmission. So therefore, when we're talking about the Java Gonju and things like that, the mind-to-mind transmission, I don't know much about mind-to-mind translation, but I think it's, you just get that same experience as the teacher has. That's, I think, the mind-to-mind transmission. And then maybe that's through certain kind of symbols or certain gestures or something like that, or through words. That's the way to. That's the instructions. That empowerment is, I think, especially for the Vajrayana. I think there's no empowerment in the Sutrayana system. It's totally Vajrayana system, and that is. Empowerment is a kind of actually, I think empowerment is also a kind of guided meditation. It's a guided meditation. It's you kind of go through the teaching. Both teacher and the student go through the experience of the practice at the same time, and then invoke the blessings of the lineage. And the teacher should have prepared and should have received and should have done the practice. And the same with the students, that they are kind of both prepared and they are open and devotion and all this, so many different elements. And then it is said that if all the elements are positive and all the right conditions are there, then you receive or you really understand how to practice, or all have the experience of that transformation. Sometimes people get like that and things like that. But even not, then we talk about three empowerments: the seed empowerment, path empowerment, and result empowerment. The seed empowerment is you just planted a seed. You just gave a certain know-how and, certain blessings. And then you use that and, practice that again and again and again. And that's what we call the path empowerment. And then at a certain time, then you actually experience it. That's called the result empowerment, which is actually, we say, now you have really completely received the empowerment. So that's how this empowerment is. So in these three ways, the transmission. But that's only speaking from the from the Dharma point of view and from the Buddhist point of view. I'm sure there are other kind of transmissions also, like we were discussing yesterday and this morning also. But I think that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Rinpoche. Our next panelist is David Germano, professor of Buddhist Studies at the University of Virginia, director of the Tibetan and Himalayan Library, which is a wonderful resource I'm sure we all use on a regular basis. He's got so many different titles and roles. He also is director of the Tibet Center at UVA, the UVA Contemplative Science Center, and almost innumerable emanations and initiatives. It's quite impressive. And of course, also deeply engaged as a scholar in Nyingma studies. So the question to David for this morning is really about modes of transmission, historically and contemporary in Tibet, and their relevance today.
Thank you. So our gathering is so graciously hosted by Tsadra, has a certain kind of intimacy about it, and an agenda that is both communal and intellectual in character. So I wanted to start with something personal, but I fear time, so I'm not going to. But I might come back to that if our... I might return to it if our gracious timekeeper permits. So, transmissions start with traditions, and traditions are beset by transience. Transience, or change, which is considered negatively as entropy and decay, or positively as transformation and renewal. Transmission aims to negotiate this fundamental transience across individuals, generations, cultures, and sometimes that transmission surmounts such immense linguistic and cultural divides that we name it translation. I want to reflect today about the relationship of transmission and transformation, and the relationship of traditions and worlds. Lineage is an age-old concern for Tibetans. We see deep concerns about the fragility of continuity across the entropy of time, the ravages of distance for such a small number of people across such an immense, treacherous terrain with so many forces of disruption, both human and inhuman. And thus we hear of adulteration, corruption, breaking and vanishing of lineage and of transmissions. At times it seems the choice, our choice, is between decay and preservation. But there is also the vitality of a transmission in perpetual transformation. Is transience or impermanence only a danger, or is it also an opportunity? Is temporality a force that we must guard against for fragile transmissions, or is it an empowering force that enables innovation and adaptation? We think translation kicks in often as we proceed across huge cultural distances, across the Himalayan mountain ranges from India to Tibet, across the Pacific Ocean from Tibet to America. But in reality and traditions, we are constantly negotiating distances, the distance of time, the distance of institutions, of smaller cultures from Chensa to Basum, the distance between you and I. When does that distance become so large that it triggers the necessity and specter of translation, or is translation perpetual? We often think of the traditions that are at stake in transmission at these lineages in terms of discrete things, a text, a ritual, a meditative practice, an ethical system. But all of these are grounded in and grounding ways of life, which are incarnated in all of these forms and beyond in narratives and art and lived lives, individual and collective, on the ground. What if we think first and foremost of worlds as being what is transmitted? How do we translate a life, and how do we transmit a world? And I'll give you 3 examples of sorts drawn from my own personal experience. I will start where I began, strangely enough, with Tibet in the 11th and 12th centuries, a turbulent time of transmissions, flowing in the Tibetan plateau from southern lands and flowing from the Tibetan soil. And one of the most creative traditions to emerge from this turbulence was the Dzogchen Nyingtik. And what is remarkable is that this singular tradition, quite small in the 11th and 12th centuries by any numerical measure, was driven to articulate an entirely distinct cosmology as its own context, encoded in prophecies, introductory scenarios of text, histories of the three bodies of the Buddhas, and more. The tradition, often talked about completely erroneously as ahistorical, was in fact profoundly cosmological and temporal in its concerns. The narrative sequentially unfold across a series of texts over 4 centuries between a divine beginning of the world and a divine end, a divine cosmogony with the original liberation of the primordial Buddha Samantabhadra, who then engages in acts of cosmogony to create worlds, and Vairochana and other cosmological Buddhas who hold vast worlds in the cavernous depths of their cosmological forms known as glacial oceans, who sustain vast, intricately interconnected cosmos with their own bodies, and in particular Vairochana, who contains our own, and the complementary acts of cosmogenesis by further manifestations of pure lands, of cultures, of Buddhas and their followers, and a complex cosmology of many different worlds, each named with its distinct description and spatial and temporal frameworks. And the 101 deeds of a Buddha across the different registers of their spiritual bodies, and the dissemination of Buddhist teachings through the agency of 3 sources of the teaching, which presence and withdraw in oscillating fashion in world system after world system. The 1,002 Buddhas and the Buddha Vajra holder with his 12 intimations, which intimately participate in our world in the form of Hindu deities, singing birds, and Shakyamuni himself. And the historical terrain of India with a succession of 5 saints who disseminate teachings prior to their concealment in Tibet, and their lives concluding with a vanishing into light, along with last testaments, only to resurrect in bodies that penetrate the Tibetan past and present and future. And the reappearance of those figures in visionary fragments to Tibetan eyes after the empire's decline, and emanations as Tibetan bodies, and as reawakened memories in Tibetan minds, and a divine end to time, the initial cosmogony mirrored by a final eschatology of the ultimate eradication of cyclic existence, when even Buddhas no longer see themselves as they withdraw into their community within the final expanse of reality. And I could talk at length on each one of these topics because they talked and thought a great deal on them. But now my point is simply that the articulation and transmission of this tradition over its first 3 centuries involved the creation of an entire formal depiction of the universe, spatially, temporally, and zoologically, that was unique to itself. It involved the creation and transmission of a world deeply interwoven with their practices and theories. And my second reflection then is in the 20th century, again on Tibetan soil, on the life and times of one of my own teachers, Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, a famed 20th century Tibetan visionary and organizer, whose activities in post-cultural revolution era gave rise to the largest Tibetan monastery in the history of Tibet, as far as I know. And I remember when I first heard of him in South India as this mysterious figure revealing treasures and working miracles up in eastern Tibet. But when I gradually came to know him and to live in his community and read his text and talk to his followers, I began to see that the transformative value in his revelations, the most transformative value, was in how he contributed to the reanimation of a lived Tibetan world. He bound together profoundly unsettled generations back to a uniquely Tibetan matrix of space and time and agency and values and more. The Cultural Revolution had devastated the transmission of that world, leaving people unmoored and adrift in an amorphous world where places lacked Tibetan names and practices and associations. Time no longer resonated with Tibetan figures, festivals, and meaning. The pantheon of agents were full of new, threatening, unknown figures, divested of the intimacy of shared values and modes of relating. And Khenpo Jigpun's visionary revelations and transmissions were key to specific places and specific times, as well as ancient narratives, and functioned to reanimate sacred landscape, pilgrimage sites, the remembered past, and the future possibilities of agency, all with deep Tibetan resonances. His new transmissions were profoundly oriented not just to personal transformation, but the collective renewal and rearticulation of the Tibetan world itself. And my third and final reflection is here and now in the United States. Over the last couple of years at the University of Virginia, I've worked extensively with others on the secular adaptation and transformation of contemplative transmissions that can be used within elementary schools, entrepreneurship training, undergraduate classes, patient care, and more. And as we've gone through this process, our attention has been absorbed by the technical details of what makes a practice religious and what are the consequences of divesting them of those religious aspects and altering them to suit new context and the developmental phases of practitioners who are often quite small. This is by no means a trivial process, and it's often struck me that it's a clear good to bring such practices, even in altered forms of concentration, attention monitoring, empathy cultivation, performance visualization, somatic awareness, and more, into a fourth grade classroom, or the self-care of a terminally ill patient. And I would not want to suggest that the people who are doing this are not often linked in these new transformations and these new transmissions to a deep concern for a broader value. And yet the more I work in these contexts, I have found myself increasingly focused on the dramatic and often deeply unconscious transformations that ensue as these practices are migrated from one world to another world, and hence thoroughly transformed in the constitutive contexts that ultimately are not incidental to their meaning and function. I've returned back to the original transmissions and traditions, both in text and lived forms, to look more closely at just what are those contexts in the Tibetan Buddhist world: temporal, spatial, intellectual, emotional, aesthetic, physical, environmental, social, and more, and to question the degree to which these are incidental contexts or the degree to which they are essentially constitutive. And this in turn has led me to an acute sense that beyond the transformative transmission of these practices into new settings, there is a far more complex challenge, and it is the one of the worlds in which we live. Our worlds are broken, and their restoration in alignment with values of insight, care, and well-being is a deeper and more complex challenge. To address it, we need to critically engage these extraordinarily complex contexts and their impact, and cultivate the skills to engage them. But when we tell ourselves stories of quintessential techniques, essential experiences, unchanging transmissions, and the triviality of context and other pursuits, I'm afraid we go seriously astray in finding the pathways in the future to meet these challenges and these opportunities. So I've spoken too much already, but I did also prepare another talk about the methods of transmission, which I can now only briefly allude to. The nature of wordless transmission to embodied knowledge, and the tacit understanding of words that comes for translators and transmitters who speak Tibetan and who live for extended periods of time in Tibetan worlds. The role of research in new transmissions, which puts into question some of the assumptions I hear voiced about academics and practitioners, and a new model for transmissional transformation in a design-based process of tradition, research, innovation, adaptation, engagement, and back again. The problem of elided provenances when in contemporary secular adaptations we erase the history of their sources. A side interest I have in the quantitative and qualitative assessment of the health of Tibetan cultures, and my wondering about whether such thinking might be transferred to thinking about the vitality of transmissions. And finally, a long-term interest of mine in the nature of revelation, inspiration, and composition in Tibetan transmissions, and reflecting on this in the light of the fascinating case of Tsultrim Dorje, Longchenpa, and the composition of the Khandro revelations across the two. So in conclusion, I would offer a vision of traditions as ongoing processes of transformation, rather than fragile products that are transmitted with a focus on guarding against entropy, and conceiving of translations as perpetual responsibilities, not special events happening once in an epic transmissions across hugely distant borders. Transmission in the final analysis, or my final analysis, is about tradition, which both constrains and enables, and the transformations that measure its vitality. And traditions begin and end with the creation, articulation, sustenance, transformation, and decline of worlds. Pure vision is that those worlds, these worlds in which we live, are the real concern of Buddhism, and that contemplation and study must ultimately find the profundity in daily experience and realities, and redeem the shared worlds in which we live, in all their messy complexity and in all their pristine simplicity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, and to all our panelists for monitoring their own spatial temporal relations. Our next speaker, Anne Klein, is professor of religious studies at Rice University. She is the founder and director of Dawn Mountain and the author of numerous books, including The Heart Essence of the Vast Expanse, A Story of Transmission, as well as Meeting the Great Bliss Queen and others. And today, Anne, if you would speak to the sensory embodied dimensions of transmission, as well as contexts and your other insights.
Such as they may be. Thank you, Holly. And first of all, really echoing through my heart mind, as I believe everyone's here, is tremendous gratitude for this amazing mandala of heart and mind and feeling and thought and presence, and just extraordinary Eric, Tsadra, all the great plenary speakers that we've heard and have yet to hear, kind of like guardians at the gates of this mandala, and inspiring us all. So it's just a tremendous thing, to be part of it. So thinking about transmission and translation, it seems to me that one perhaps is actually a subcategory of the other. They are distinct, but not completely separable. And then, of course, what exactly is transmission, and what is the famous it, and what are we doing about all of that? And reflecting on that, it occurred to me that perhaps the very central thing, really, that we're talking about, or at least that I think I'm talking about for a few minutes, is what else is there? We have had many, starting with a wonderful David's conversation that began our conference, many indications of our shared observation that there is something more than just meaning, whatever that is. Something more than just words. And we are warned. Borges has a great phrase where he describes translation wrongly understood. He's actually talking about Ezra Pound as, a philological labor undertaken in great fear of the dictionary. And clearly, okay, that's not exactly what we're talking about. And David in the plenary, it is so much, actually, in your book, I think, talk about, well, of course, as Janet also said, there's gesture, there's tone, there's timing, there's the relationship with the text, Greg so beautifully expressed, and many others also, Gavin, we have a relationship with the text, physical and kind of spiritual and visual. And we have a relationship with the person through whom we come to know a text. And I had what was to me a kind of shocking realization some years back now that I was quite shy to express for quite some time, but that I never would have gotten so passionately interested in Tibetan texts, which are so complicated and hard to understand, if it hadn't been that they provided me with an opportunity to talk with somebody, to explain it. And I would sit through, just to be in the presence, and anyway, you know what I'm talking about. So the relationship, and as Rinpoche, you were saying, with the teacher, with the tradition, with oneself, actually, because the relationship with oneself that begins to emerge, I think, as we talk about transmission, is that something does resonate through one's system. So, and what is that? So we're duly warned that we need to think about something other than just the meaning. And as rich as words are, even when we understand that words are not just meaning, and Ezra Pound famously talks about needing to translate, their words have sound, they have an imageic quality, they have a context that they come in, and all of this feeds into our understanding of words. So just there, that's already quite rich. What more is there? It seems to me that when we talk about transmission, we have an invitation to see if we can articulate something about that more. And that what appealed to me as I was ruminating about these precious 10 minutes to talk with you is, so what if I try to think about this moreness of transmission in Tibetan categories that, so I have a kind of little medley of very well-known Tibetan categories that I think are very significant for thinking about what transmission is about. And maybe it's not so tangential or accidental that we have this wonderful homonymal relationship between transmission, which is often what is translating the word lung, the text, and then we have this great word lung, wind, movement. And certainly, as Janet and others have said, there is movement in transmission. There is movement that can be felt in the body. And that if we look at Tibetan categories also in terms of how we understand the embodied experience of someone who is offering or participating in lung, in both senses. And also, we know, as Rinpoche has again reminded us, that these texts were and still are speech. They are speech. So then I have a few little quotes that I just kind of like. Is that showing up there? How do I get this to? Jigme Lingpa, in his, I'll just say the categories that I'm sort of weaving together are lung, wind, a jinlap, what is that? This also seems to involve some kind of transmission. Also yeshe, which seems in some iterations to have its own agency in this process, as has already been hinted at. And then maybe something about chinchi, which might seem a quite different category of terminology, but I think it's important as we try to understand what's going on. So Jigme Lingpa, I have a few quotes from his wisdom chats. This first line is where I'm coming from. Saying is speech, and the nature of speech is wind, lung. So we have texts as lung, and we have speech as lung, and there seems to me a lot of meaning in that. Definitely showing us that there is something, even in our mental functioning, that arises out of the words that we hear. There's a process that inevitably involves the lung in our body, the lung in its relationship to mind, and that's just everyday life. And that is also part of who we are as listeners, as Janet so eloquently talked about. And maybe I'm going to skip here for a moment. Can I just go to this one? I'll come back. So lung, of course, is a very well-developed category in the Tibetan tradition. And not just significant in esoteric traditions is the point I want to make, but this is from an oral tradition, that a very simple classification of lung. So there's the lung that is just kind of undirected, just kind of whatever's flowing through you at any particular moment due to context and circumstances and so on. And there's also lung, of course, that is directed, that is to say, a function of very particular practices. And then there's also beyond both, which in some sense is where both lung and lung, transmission and flowing, are directed to this state beyond both, perhaps we can say, which invites us to consider, again, the matter of wisdom. So here we are, these lunged up creatures in both senses, and what is it that we're trying to accomplish by offering meaning, cum, whatever else goes with it, to a being? As both Rinpoche and David have said, there is definitely a larger picture. It's both in Buddhism, both I think in us as in our own Western feelings about what the texts we read and the practices that we may or may not practice can contribute to this culture. Really thank David for that. I think that's a very important overarching concern. So anyway, what's it all about? How do we get to some other kind of perspective within a Buddhist context? Well, mind-free realization requires completing the accumulations. What's that got to do with meaning? That's the whole accumulations of method and wisdom and prostrations and mantra and all of that. Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I'll just kind of leave it up there. Purifying the two obstructions, grace waves of the Lama, Chinlap. Chinlap, the chin, as you all know, can mean give, but it also means something like, charisma, majesty, this kind of magnetism that certainly affects us and is certainly part of transmission. As it is says in Sutra, the teacher's word is ultimate. And this is the line I really want to point to. Through open-hearted devotion, there will be realization. And so we see that in the Tibetan context, we don't have this kind of bifurcation between the intellectual activities of, those weird academics and the sort of stuffy and, inhibited and all that. And then the great practitioners, but maybe they don't understand what they're really doing that well. So, right here, a fundamental premise of the whole thing is that, no, guess what, folks? We have minds and we have energies, and these are both, somehow interacting in our being. And surely what we are doing as translators, and surely whatever transmission comes with our translation and whatever transmission is and is communicating, it is communicating to this kind of an organism. That's kind of really what I want to talk about. So it's not a head-to-head thing like the Academy pretends it is sometimes. And also, a little bit of a digression, but as I was thinking of this, it seems to me that this recognition that what we have to give to each other by way of teaching, by way of communication, in many, many contexts, is more than just intellectual understanding, is really one of the meaning horizons of our time. Certainly it's important in this conference. It's also important, neuroscience, talking relatively recently about things like mirror neurons, which don't really mirror, but they do have something to, it's kind of neuroscience's way of talking about communication not being just words. And also what has been discovered about the profound human orientation to mimicry. A baby of, I forget, a few hours old, just incredibly, will mimic, will see, and will, respond to the face of its mother or caretaker. That's amazing. It's hardwired into us. And in so many of our contexts, talking about language perhaps, teaching perhaps, we haven't paid attention to that. And yet there's some huge percentage of the brain, I forget exactly what it is, that is actually dedicated to facial recognition of facial expression. And we've already mentioned many times how this is certainly part of transmission, the raised eyebrow or whatever else it is. So open-hearted devotion, it's my translation sometimes for Teba, because Teba also, when it's translated as faith, can be understood, in this sort of Christian context as I believe such and such a thing. And it almost, again, becomes a sort of cognitive idea. I have an idea that such and such happened, and so I have faith. And I don't think that's what the Tibetan context is talking about. So another thing to bring in from the Tibetan context, again, so once we're talking about lung, these flows, these inner currents, okay, we're talking about the body. Speech is sound. Sound moves through the body through energy. And Longchenpa famously says, primordial wisdom abides in the body. So there's something in our body that's kind of, ready to be awakened. And maybe that's part of what transmission does. Kind of wakes us up in some kind of way. He says, we do not, I'm reading Richard Barron's translation, we do not realize that primordial wisdom is present in the body. That's the big problem. And we can't just realize it by somebody saying, guess what? Guess what your body is full of? And he's like, what are you talking about? I can hardly stand up straight. Full of primordial wisdom, aches and pains? I don't think so. But this is something, if we're going to look at this in a Tibetan context, this we have to take account of. This is what we're translating for, an embodied being with wisdom in it. The awareness known as Buddha nature, I love this, is enmeshed in the physical body. And so the term embodied being, Luchen, is used. That's why we're called bodies. Because we're bodies of wisdom. Isn't that what your mother taught you when you were, learning how to tie your shoes to protect the wisdom in your body from the harsh road ahead of life and all other things? And then also, again, this kind of medley of terms, wisdom itself. So another great statement of Longchen Rabchen, which interestingly enough, he says this in the context of talking about Madhyamaka in Tsadra. Ultimate truth, in essence, a freedom from dualistic elaborations, in that it cannot be realized by means of verbal descriptions. We all know that, but this is the line I'm after. It cannot be understood by means of anything other than itself. What's a translator to do? And so with this kind of target being and target community, as David was saying, how does this actually, this is the other question that I was sort of daring myself to consider, okay, this is kind of great to think about. How will it actually affect our actual work of translation? Ooh, I don't know. But then I thought, I was happy Gavin yesterday mentioned the word tunchi. And because I also started to think, well, what we're really trying to do when, not just in translating, just as human beings, when we're talking to somebody, we are looking for a certain kind of, I don't know what to say, reaction? A certain kind of, we want something to happen. Maybe we want them to get a certain image. Maybe we want them to know how we feel about them so that maybe they'll open up a little bit and we'll have more of a grounded human-to-human conversation or different things like that. And so it seems to me that when we, at least for me, when I think of it that way, it seems to give a certain kind of, I don't know, relaxation, permission to actually be more curious and experimental about words that we use and not so fearfully tied to the dictionary, even though, of course, we have to be tied to it for a very, very long time, before we kind of earn the some kind of right or, really it makes sense to try to spring a little bit free. We want to, in the Dharma context, are we looking to further to tap into, awaken the wisdom in the body to guide the person toward, koa, understanding, or nyam, or even dopa? Is that the intention, which the translator at least doesn't want to interfere with? And this thing about kind of more permission to look more broadly at a possible translation and to consider the context in which a translation is given. And at that time, I happened to be, I think I got an email, I'm on a list of Ken MacLeod, and I thought, okay, do I dare? I'm going to talk about, so he writes that he is translated, he talks a lot about, the process of meditation as releasing us from patterns, from habits. So he actually translates samsara as patterns, habit patterns. And so, the dictionary part of me and maybe you goes, what? That's not, where do you get the curve? Where do you get the rounded? But that's actually what a habit is. It takes you back and back again over your territory. He's trying to get a very particular message across. And so maybe if we think in terms of transmission, there's a willingness to say, well, okay. And he translates, I think, nirvana as something like freedom from habit. I may not have it exactly right, so apologies for that. But it's an example of in one sense, a free translation. Not literal, maybe wrong in certain contexts, but also given the context that he was defining in that particular work that he was talking about, the process that he was talking about, it kind of did make sense. So I guess a whiff of freedom seems to come with the all of this, and just again, it seems important for us, simply to me, as an exercise to really look wherever we can at categories in the Tibetan tradition itself, as well as we can understand them, that speak to this question of translation and transmission.
Thank you so much. We've been having our own symbolic communication up here. I do the raised eyebrow thing. So our next speaker, thank you so much, Anne, is John Canti, who is president of the Padmakara Translation Committee. He's also a Tsadra Fellow and the editorial chair for the 84,000 project. So very, very busy full-time translator. And John, if you could speak to the expectations of the transmitter and the recipient, and in terms of authority, authenticity, other categories, and what happens if these ideas actually clash?
So, first of all, I'd like to add my appreciation to that of all the other speakers for this conference, which grew out of Eric's Namtok. Fortunately, he didn't just dissolve, but allowed to proliferate into this extraordinary, what I hope, extraordinary, for me extraordinary, and I think for everybody, event with many benefits. It's so difficult to talk about transmission as such a general category. It just covers everything, doesn't it, really? That the whole Dharma is a transmission. On top of that, everybody else has already said most of what there is to say. Magnificent talk from Janet Gyatso this morning, which covered so many aspects, and then all my fellow panelists. So I'm the kind of last to try and sort of wrap it up. Of course, we're going to go on this afternoon to talk about more about transmission and translation. I would have found it much easier to talk about translation because that's more what I do. I had this kind of thought for the last few days, what on earth am I going to say about transmission? I don't really do that, you know. But of course, that's not really true. As a translator, as everybody has pointed out, we are inextricably involved with transmission. And in fact, as a translator, would be impossible without having been the recipient of transmission in so many different ways. So I've sort of got a sort of bullet list here of topics, which is partly, of course, just so that I don't go too off track, but it's not drawn from any text, and it's by no means exhaustive, but I thought it would be useful to try and think of some of the different ways in which we can see transmission and some of the ingredients of transmission. And this started with the original question, which has got a little bit diluted, which was, what's the difference between just communication of information, sort of mechanical, if you like, and transmission? And then again, sort of, obviously, it's a two-way process, transmission, that requires a transmitter and a receiver. So how do the transmitter and the receiver perceive what's going on, and you know, what happens if their expectations are a little bit different, which they're obviously bound to be. So first of all, I think really one of the most important things is that transmission is not that different from any form of teaching. You know, I remember being very struck when I first met Tibetans talking about Dharma, was the idea that this was incredibly practical. It was a bit like hearing somebody describe how to grow a crop. And I'm not sure if there's any real difference of kind between, you know, learning, between the transmission of Dharma and learning how to grow artichokes. You know, somebody can teach you what to do. They can give you some seeds. They can explain how artichokes are grown, what kind of soil you need, what kind of conditions, and then you know, how you get from there to actually having grown some artichokes. But of course, what really makes the difference is the second of our categories here, and this is something we've talked about quite a lot yesterday, this mysterious intention. I was a little puzzled yesterday because we were talking about intention as in some sense as motivation, which of course is one important aspect, but the other thing is the gongpa, the idea behind it all, which really connects with the it. You know, what is it that we're transmitting? And it seems to me that, you know, of course, individual teachings and things have quite complex its, but the basic it that that's behind all of the transmission of Dharma is, awakening. How do you attain enlightenment, or whatever you like to call it? How do you get from where we are now to some much greater understanding? Seen another way, how do you get from your kind of confused state to some state which approaches the nature of things as they really are? So this is where the idea again of transformation comes in to transmission. The transmission would be sort of pointless and useless if it wasn't actually changing the receiver. And again, this is the idea that there's the Dharma of transmission, the Long, the Lungkichö, and the Tokpachö, the Dharma of realization, which is supposed to be the result that happens in the receiver. So without that transformation, in some sense, again, if the teaching, if the transmission is mainly about the knowledge, how to do something, it can stay as being, what's again in the traditional terms is called being kepa, knowing how to do something, but missing out the other very important aspect, which is the drupa, actually attaining it and achieving that. So obviously that's the kind of main line here, really. How do you get from one person's experience, one person's knowledge, one person's what one person received themselves and managed to transform in their own being to somebody else? That's the sort of big question that's been the whole process of Dharma all down through the ages. But this again brings in the notion of preservation. It passes from, this is something obviously from individual to individual in one sense, but in another sense, if it wasn't transmitted from person to person over the generations, then there would be nothing left. So there is a very big concern, which in the initial phase is more in the mind of the transmitter. How am I going to make sure that what I have received and realized, I'm not talking about myself, of course, here, how am I going to make sure that that is not lost? And so identifying receivers who might be capable of receiving this, who might be capable of undergoing that transformation, and to what extent. Obviously, it's not all just finding your single personal disciple who's going to carry on, but it's a question of spreading the Dharma, spreading the knowledge, using it in whatever way is possible to alleviate suffering, to bring people into the various states of happiness that we would wish for them. So after the aspect of preservation, I think there's another very important aspect that we haven't talked about much, which is the ethics of transmission. Actually, it's very important for the transmission to happen properly that the transmitter is very clear that what they're transmitting is not what they think or not what they've added or invented, but actually just what they received. So, of course, if this is the kind of gongpa, the pure sort of famous it, it's an experience, if you like. It's a whole way of seeing the world. It's probably something far beyond what the receiver is ever going to be able to understand. And so that has to happen within certain conditions, which are defined by the ethics of the transmission. And that is something that the transmitter will be far more aware of than the receiver. But there are also aspects of ethics that concern the receiver. The receiver's making commitments. I think even in a simple sort of sutra-type based teaching, there's a certain commitment to understand, to think about what's been received, to try and integrate it into experience in order to come back to the transformation. And of course, in the Vajrayana transmission, there's a whole lot of very specific commitments that are made, which ensure that the person doesn't misuse and abuse the whatever it is, the famous it, that they've received. Personal contact is obviously, as all of us, all of my panelists, and as Janet has said as well, I think really essential here. And I think, as Anne said, we are, as sort of biological beings, we're supremely well adapted to understanding something from being in the presence of somebody else and what that person has to offer to us and to communicate. And of course, this isn't just a one-off, one-time business. It's an ongoing, apprenticeship, if you like, very often. Of course, there are instances where you just have a single ritual where you're in the presence of a great teacher who transmits something, and that's another matter. But the sort of nitty-gritty, essential material through which the transformation of transmission happens is by being with a teacher. Very interesting quote from one of the early, I think, sutras, where Ananda comes out of retreat and he says to the Buddha, "Hey, I've realized that the spiritual teacher is really half the path." And the Buddha says, "No, you're completely wrong. Please don't say that. The spiritual teacher is the whole path." And that's obviously a very important message. For nowadays, that brings up the question of how much can be done without that personal contact, if it's not possible. Can you transmit something through YouTube, or can you, can it be as a one-way communication? Well, I think parts of it can be, but I think not the whole thing. And if we ever lose in the sort of Dharma idea of Dharma transmission, if we ever lose the idea of personal contact and the centrality of personal contact, then I think we're doomed, actually. I do know people getting last-minute instructions just before dying by telephone. And, again, I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but apparently very effectively. So, there's nothing wrong, there's really nothing wrong with using any means of communication. We don't always have to be in the presence of the person. And then this comes up, that wouldn't work unless there had been certain preconditions, certain relationship developed already. And this is a very, very important issue of the sort of pre-existing context into which any transmission is placed. I have a rather sad story about some people I knew recently who came to receive teachings in France, an intelligent professional couple, and received an initiation. And then shortly afterwards, the husband developed cancer and died rather unpleasantly in hospital. And the wife was terribly angry afterwards with the teacher who'd given the transmission, and because she came to him and said, "You said that receiving this transmission would be enough to gain enlightenment, and my husband died without that. So why did you say that? You're lying." And this is a sort of terrible misunderstanding of the whole context of transmission. In a way, you could admire her sort of sincerity and acceptance of that statement. But in another way, it was simply, it's not her fault, but she just did not have the sort of background where we would, most of us, if you've been sort of around in these kind of situations, then you know that means that if all conditions were right and great, and that it sort of accentuates the power and importance of this transmission, but it's not a sort of contract or a kind of written guarantee. So that pre-existing context is very important, and I think that as translators, one of the main contributions we are making is in providing, the sort of coverage of all the different issues that can be, of all the different, I don't really like the word issues, all the different subjects, all the different categories, all the different ways of seeing the teachings that can provide the sort of background knowledge that people would really need to be able to receive transmission properly. Ritual, I'm going to have to go over this very quickly. Very, very important. Again, the ritual of empowerment, as Rinpoche was saying, this is actually a kind of guided meditation, but even for those who are receiving a sort of mass empowerment on the periphery without really understanding what's happening, there must be something happening. There's a connection being made, a kind of karmic link, seed, if you like, that must be important. Very, as David was saying, very, very important culturally in a community, the way a ritual, a big mass empowerment or something like that brings everybody together and makes them feel that something happened, and that's very important and not at all to be denigrated. Cultural transfer, I put it in as a final point, which I think is very important. Another aspect of transmission, how it gets from one culture to another. I simply don't have time to talk about it, but I'm sure it will come up. So I better stop there. Is that right? And so we can open the discussion.
Thank you so much. Now we have about 15 minutes for the panelists to talk amongst themselves, and then we'll have a half an hour for questions and answers with the whole group. And I have to say, this is so rich, not just your list, John, but we had a lot of answers to the question of the it factor. What is transmission? And I'll just repeat them as a harvest, and then we can discuss more. The Dharma in terms of Lung and Tokpa, the transmission of worlds, Lung in the two senses that Anne spoke about, awakening, ultimate truth, Chinlap, teachings, intention, contact, and also contract were interesting words, and many other things. So it's nice to have this multiplicity and perhaps even challenge of how to reconcile these, or but I'm going to let the panelists really respond to each other rather than posing a question, either in terms of comments or further questions.
Rinpoche, I would like to ask what you think. A lot of people bring up the objection that when there's a mass empowerment, and there's a lot of people sitting there, and of course some people will be really following it very closely, understanding what they have to meditate on, what they have to visualize, what they have to think, how they have to feel, and going through it all. But some people will be, the old lady sitting in the back and chatting to her neighbor, and what do you think is happening? What is the value of receiving empowerment under those circumstances?
Well, I think this is like even Buddha's time. It was like that. I think. I don't have time maybe for a story, but I have a story. But Buddha's time, when somebody came up to Buddha and he asked, I'm here and I've been, listening to your teachings. It's very nice. But then, I have not changed very much, I see that some people have changed very much and some people a little bit benefited, but I have not changed. And there are many people like that. Why is it like that? And the Buddha said, where you come from? He says he's from Gaya. So he says, okay, do you give, the way to go to Gaya for some of your friends? He says, yes. And he says, all of those people who you receive this, the way to go to Gaya, do they reach Gaya? He said, well, I don't know. And some of them will really follow my instructions and they really go there, they will reach there, So he says the same with me, So, you give empowerment and, well, there, there used to be sometimes, and sometimes it's even now, that some lamas don't want to give the empowerments to everybody. They want to restrict it, and they want commitments and all these things. And some others, they give it to everybody. So those who understand and those who really practice, they sometimes get more benefit. But those who don't understand much and they receive it as a blessing. And then I think it's all about actually in Buddhism, the blessing is not really about giving; it's about receiving. Because Buddha is always supposed to give blessings. There's nothing like, now I don't want to give any blessing to this person. He's not a Buddha. So therefore, it's all about receiving. And so if somebody who has some, some trust or some devotion, seeing things like that, and then sitting there, doesn't know much about things, so of course she will talk to the neighbor because she can't even understand what's going on. Or you're sleeping all the time or something like that. And then that might also, if she says, yeah, I've received the blessing, and then she kind of prays to that, Lama, or maybe some mantras or something like that, it could be some use or some, importance for that person. So, I think it's taken in that way when people give empowerments in the big ways. But of course, there's always, people always complain, even in the traditional way, in Tibetan traditions, that these transmissions sometimes become too much like just a ritual or just a tradition. And it should not become just like a tradition and just like it, because if it just becomes a tradition and a ritual, then it doesn't have any meaning. So I think it's an important thing to understand that in essence, it's not a tradition. It's not a tradition. It's not a ritual. It's a transmission or a transformation. But of course, in a human society, it becomes a tradition. But I think the importance is to understand that. So therefore, then the tradition, you understand the meaning, why you do this in that tradition. Otherwise, it becomes not very useful. So there's lots of, I think, warning or in the traditional, really Dharma teachings that it should not just become a tradition.
One very common theme, it seems to me, across our discussions and others as well, just the word relationship is coming up for me in what you just said, Rinpoche, and what David said about a relationship to the present time coming from the past, all the things that you talked about, the meaning of transmission. And maybe there, if we think of it in terms of relationship, that also opens up a way of understanding what our project is and the different levels of relationship. And would you like to discuss further what you feel your work or thinking has to do with that, with relationship? And even as Rinpoche was talking, I was also thinking about, Rime, and that perhaps looking at the somatic side of things, we all have bodies, maybe a way of also walking into the sort of the Rime open space of relationship. So That's for anyone, including you.
Well, I was thinking a little bit about that in terms of your comments, and so I just have some incoherent reflections on that. One was Janet mentioned, or I thought she was talking about something to do with the collective dimension of enlightenment. And so I think often when we talk about transmission, we tend to focus on it as a highly personal process, and then we talk about these big public things with the kind of question that, John, you just asked. And I think we should think more maybe about transmission as a process of communal change and cultural shift. So that's one kind of issue that I'm thinking about there, and that relates to relationships. Another is, we were talking a lot in Janet's talk and also in other discussions about these transformations that happen, that interactions you have with another person, in this context primarily with your teacher, acts as a trigger for these changes in our brain and our body and our instincts and our relationships and so forth. And what strikes me as a little bit odd is we seem to be so surprised by that. In fact, that happens every minute of our lives. Every minute of our lives. And if you look at the body of psychological research in a variety of fields over the past 2 decades, you can see it's just a tremendous amount of discoveries that we're finding about how we are in perpetual ferment and the way in which we are deeply connected to other people outside of the linguistic process of exchanges. And so I think it would be, sometimes I think we look at these special things that happen in the context of transmissions and we think it would be cheapening them to relate them to this kind of ordinary life. But from my perspective, it's really not a trivialization, but it enriches it. When I look at the psychological research and these kind of different areas, it gives me a much more profound understanding of the type of interaction that might be transpiring between myself and a teacher or myself and fellow students and so forth. So that was another thought I had.
There's even a category of kind of realization, state of mind, but particularly to do with receptivity, where it's said that anything that happens to you, every phenomenon that you might come across, actually acts as your teacher, which again is sort of, to me, very, very sort of telling that with the right receptivity, there's actually no limit to what can be a means of transmission. What is the term? Nangwa Daye Lama, is it? Something like that.
From that point of view, I think, we also talk about receiving transmission, and the relationship and what we call the basic philosophy of Buddhism is interdependence, and many things coming together, in the right conditions coming together. Like we talked about Wang, and not only Wang, but I think every transmission is also, I think, like that, in the right conditions coming together, and that helps to transform, whether it's individual or a group or a culture. But it's not like that. The group or the society or culture. I think from Buddhist point of view, it's not like a society is made of individuals. So individual transformations becomes a kind of culture or civilization or groups. So therefore, there is, the more people become transformed, the more it affects everybody. Isn't it like that?
I think there's also one thing that we haven't talked about much is perhaps the what is non-transmission, or what is false transmission, or what is what could you say? What can we say about when transmission is apparently happening but is actually not happening? Again, I suppose this would go back to I think one of the criteria would be perhaps what I was calling the ethics of transmission. If those are not being observed, if the intention isn't right, if the if the transmitter's own personal qualities aren't right, then although transmission may appear to be happening, it probably won't have the desired result. But is there anything else we could say about non-transmission or false transmission?
So I've thought a lot about that in terms of the last number of years I've been working in Tibetan communities, and I was asked by a particular federal funding agency to explain the health of Tibetan communities. And they kept persisting and asking me, how do you assess the health of that Tibetan village and their cultural traditions and so forth, or the health of that cultural region? And for a while I just kept saying, leave me alone. And what do you want me to say? And then I started to think about, well, how would you go about that process of thinking about a particular village or cultural region and thinking about what is the status of the culture there? Because if you're going to be putting funding there and doing various kinds of programs, how would you assess whether they have an impact if you haven't even figured out what the baseline is? And so I began thinking about that, and what I found it really useful was, and I think I would find it useful in terms of the answer to your question, it made me think, what is Tibetan culture? Because I really did not know. And most of the people I saw doing various kinds of community programming in Tibet, they did not know. They had never analytically thought about what the culture was that they were really trying to impact. They thought of it in terms of obvious things like, are they speaking the language? Do they have Tibetan literacy and so forth? I tell you, if that's all that you measure Tibetan culture by, you're never going to successfully intervene, or not intervene, but help in a participatory movement in a positive direction forward. So in the same way that your question makes me think, what is transmission? We often use singular words like you just said, result, but in fact there's so many results, many of which the texts name and many which they don't name. And for us to analytically think about, for this transmission, what really are the consequences, including ones we've never formally named to ourselves, then we could begin to come up with a much more nuanced picture of how we might assess non-transmission, transmission, partial transmission, etc. So I think that's a great question.
I wonder about the category of non-transmission. You know, there might be a not optimum transmission or maybe even harmful transmission. But if we're right about what we seem to be inching toward in terms of understanding about transmission, it's something that is always occurring, not just in these special occasions. We're human beings. We transmit. That's what human beings do. And as Janet was saying, this somehow wisdom or knowledge is in the mix, you know, certainly in a traditional Tibetan context. The wisdom is participating in some way, and in religious studies this has sort of started to become recognized as a category of, you know, the mystery or the unfolding. I'm forgetting the exact term of art that is used, but so there's some, even though wisdom present everywhere isn't exactly a Western way of thinking about things, it may be a helpful inspiration to us to see that there are some parallels in our own way of thinking, that there is always more operating, you know, than we know. And so how to optimize that so that transmission occurs, so that basically communication occurs optimally, and that it's individual and communal. And
I feel there is, I think, lots of discussions in the kind of teachings about the wrong transmission, because when they are talking about examining the teachers and, you know, examining whether it's a qualified teacher or good teacher or not and things like that, I think that's based on the understanding that there could be a very bad transmission, and it could be harmful. Yeah, because if good things can be transmitted, bad things can be transmitted too, and maybe even more easily.
I had a thought about how this impacts upon translation, which has often kind of come up. So fine, you think about these things, but how does it actually impact upon my translation? And so I'll tell you about my favorite term that I always come back to. For those of you who know, it won't be a surprise. It's lugugyu.
What?
Lugugyu.
Lugugyu.
Yeah. And so I had studied and thought about lugugyu and, you know, played around with these practices and so forth in my own way. And I remember once I was on Kangri Tokar, the retreat home of Longchenpa in central Tibet, and I was walking up a mountainside, and I noticed some lambs on the mountainside, and they were all, there was a little nomadic kid, or half nomadic agrarian kid, who was following behind the lambs, and each one was tied together by the neck. And because they were going across the mountainside, they were undulating. Some were down, some below, and of course, visually, exactly, phenomenologically, what the practice of Lugugyu is about. And when you ask someone, they'll say, oh, that means a chain, it means whatever. It doesn't mean little linked lambs. But of course it means little linked lambs. And when I saw that, these things just galvanized for me, and I began to think of these texts that I was translating and studying and so forth, and realizing there was a profoundly nomadic imagery that was at work here. It wasn't just about little linked lambs. There's the process where you bring them into the corral, and there's all this imagery of wondering and vastness and so forth. And I began to think differently about these texts, not just as high-level philosophy and contemplation, but as grounded in a stunningly transformative vision of a world, a Tibetan world, that they birthed in the 11th century out of their own imagination and their own society and their own experiences. And it became a much more profound experience for me to read the text in that way. And so that's an example of how your understanding of the worlds in which the texts are born and sustained can change the way you translate.
But also it highlights the incredible difficulty on that sort of level of transferring that same, those insights and those what was considered really important in that whole system to such a completely different cultural context as the modern world.
It doesn't go over in America so well.
Well, in another way, it does. What I hear you also saying, and you did say it explicitly before, is that there are ways of grounding these very esoteric things that we're talking about and saying, wait a second, this is also us. Our communication is also transmission. The undulation of the lambs is also something that can kind of have a reflection in a different dimension of our experience. And our bodies are always here and being impacted. And these things, I don't know, to me there's a kind of hopeful message there of that, well, whatever we're talking about, in some ways the vectors also all come back here to us in our own experience. And there's a kind of, I don't know, permission. I know I'm not being very clear, but I'm getting just a kind of image of, when you say also that you are bringing, certain principles into play in a secular context. And that is a grounding of, seeing something in this American context that could be in conversation with something else, related with principles that you already have, or that you have as a Westerner, and that are resonating in some way with material that we're translating, that gives us as, as curious translators some kind of authority to explore the relevance, the reverberation maybe, the complicated communication between this material and our experiences that are just as real to us as the undulating lambs are on the Tibetan landscape.
I wonder though, Anne, and I know I'm breaching my role as moderator.
Please
here,
breach.
But when we think about either creating a fluent translation or one that's foreignizing, I feel like in a way what David's asking us to do as translators is to invoke the world of the text and invite people into that world so that we're standing on that ground looking out at those little lambs, or we're at Dzogchen hearing the dogs barking, and that there's something about that world or that context that then actually allows for a more subtle form of communication that may only be possible, let's say, in a highly structured ritual, or may only be possible in the sort of subtle cues that are almost symbolic that we could give in a translation itself. And so how to create the context for a transmission, which I feel like everybody's been talking about as communication itself. How can we actually facilitate by creating a kind of context in the literary style that we use in our translation, or in actual context like this? How wonderfully people can hear when there's a platform and microphones and all the attention is focused properly. And so somehow to be able to bring that into translation could be really both a challenge but also an inspiration.
And also maybe to be inspired to learn by this way of looking at the world that you've just described, seeing lambs and somehow making this other kind of connection, to learn that we could also look at our world in that way. And I think you said something explicitly about that, or maybe that was in a conversation over dinner, the sacredness of our world and being able to see that.
I mean, if we don't redeem our world and all of its reality, then I really don't know what we're doing. We don't have another one. I mean,
Yeah.
But I remember it's a crazy example, but anyway, it just popped up. When I was a student in Cambridge in the 70s, we had this kind of crazy Japanese guy came by to give a sort of retreat, and it was a sort of Zen, session. And after, he later, he pretty much went off the rails. But I remember very much, I was really impressed one day. He came in from having taken a walk outside, in a busy street. And he said, traffic noise and exhaust fumes, perfect. So, and he's completely right, of course. If we go beyond all dualism and everything, then these value judgments that we put on this terrible world of ours, in a way they sort of fall away. And perhaps in the future, instead of lying on the grass under the beautiful starry sky and saying, can you hear the dogs bark? It might be you're sitting in a busy street, can you hear the trucks roaring? Can you smell the fumes? So it's everything is transposable, and we have to be open to that.
I was thinking that this we were talking about transmission, but what it's related with translation, like for instance, how much receiving the transmissions, any different kind of transmission. So how much transmission is received by the translator reflects or helps the translation. I think because I think it's I find that some what the translation has to be is it's something to be correct, but something to be we call it Daksal and Duzang. It should be correct, but also very clear for the people who are reading it, and then it should be like not mixed up but very clean. And sometimes I feel that when I see a translation, I can almost see whether he is really a practitioner or not. Because if he's a practitioner and has really studied or something, then it's much more clearer. The translation becomes much more simpler and clearer. And if he has not really is a practitioner, then it becomes, to me, almost ununderstandable.
I was just going to say that I think that was beautifully put, and I would just put it into a larger context of we have many forms of practice. Our lives are practices. And to only think of it in terms of whether we do these particular Buddhist practices, the sadhana or whatever it might be, there are other kinds of practices by which we engage with Buddhism and we engage with the Tibetan world and so forth. And for me, I've always thought of it primarily as a love affair. I love Tibet. And I love Buddhism, and that's the context in which I have a relationship. And so I do many practices, some formally that you could recognize and say, oh, he's doing this, and others that maybe are unconscious in character.
I just have an anecdote. A friend of mine, who I won't name, who might be here, told me of a difficult text that was this person's project to translate, and receiving the lung only up to a certain portion of it. And to this person's utter surprise and amazement, arriving at that boundary in the text, found that the translation didn't work, couldn't do it, couldn't translate anymore, and told me, And I always thought that was just kind of some superstition.
So this is such a wonderful conversation, and I do want to make sure to leave some time for Q&A. So why don't we shift gears at this point? And I'd like to request the audience to actually pose a question, and to pose that question quite briefly so that somebody can address it. So we will start on the long side.
I'll try to be brief. Thank you all. And I want to pick up on a point raised by David Germano, which is that we ignore context at our peril. I'm afraid that some of what I'm about to say might be perceived as impolitic, and I don't mean it to be, but in this context, it might be. I'm looking at the list here, and I'm seeing room for what I'm about to say, but no explicit gesturing in the direction of what I'm about to say, which is that one of the entailments has to be the establishment of authority, right? The question, how does one know when transmission has been affected, right? If you think of the context in which that question is asked, when would you ask it? Why would you ask it? Presumably because you're looking for a teacher, right? Or you want to know, does that person qualify as a teacher? And so I'm wondering, it feels to me authority has come up several times in the discussion, but then it's sort of been shunted to the side. And I was wondering if you all had some remarks specifically and explicitly on the establishment of authority. Thanks.
I would just say, first of all, that my omission to not have put authority on the list, obviously it's an extremely important point, and it's sort of a little bit compressed, so I wasn't able to talk about it, but this is really part of the interrelationship between the transmitter and the receiver. There has to come a point where the transmitter feels that somebody has is ready to start, or perhaps is ready to become a transmitter, and all of these issues. It's a business about feedback and knowing what stage transmission has reached, and then authority is obviously all to do with that, and very, very important.
Well, I think it's absolutely central. And I think one of the things that worries me is that as someone who's lived for many years in Tibet and different kinds of religious contexts and so forth, people don't agree with each other. It's not simply different strokes for different folks. They have different visions of the future, and they have different commitments. And a lot of that has to do with issues of authority and so forth. And if we don't raise those questions in the context of religious communities and transmissions and so forth, then they're just going to go unchecked. So I think it needs to be raised explicitly and needs to be thought out, not simply by people who are academics, but anybody who's involved and cares about the future of these things. And one of the big differences that I've seen in Tibetan communities back in Tibet is this issue of, is Buddhism something that should involve social action and responsibility beyond the metaphysical justification? And there is an intense amount of criticism behind the scenes by major figures back and forth to each other on this issue. And whether you choose not to know about it or not, I can tell you it's certainly happening. And it's because they have different visions of what Buddhism should be in Tibet.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. My question really relates to what is entailed in the process of transmission and the idea of bodily presence, bodily transformation, physical presence, and the fact that we now have Lung being offered by teachers on the web, via webcast, and whether I'd be interested to hear the comments from the panelists of whether you think that has any effect on that particular process.
I feel that it's just my personal, personal opinion. There's nothing I think there is nothing written that Lung cannot be done through other means or anything like that, or it can be done. But as it is, it's kind of a permission to, now it is. I mean, Lung is more like a permission to practice. So many lamas, because they cannot go to those places, so those students cannot meet that lama, and then can receive it through internet or Skype or something like that. I don't see any problem there, because whether you are sitting end of 10,000 people, or another continent through the. I think it's the contact with that lama is more or less same, I think. And so from that point of view, I personally feel that it's okay, but that's just my personal opinion.
So I think if we look at that in terms of the larger context, not simply of transmitting the Lung, but different ways that you might interact with students and others in the context of the distributed environment of the web, I think the important thing is you have to realize it's a different medium. It's not necessarily bad or impossible, but it's a different medium. Namely, when you're together with people in physical presence, or you're working with people in a highly distributed fashion around the world, it can work and be extraordinarily successful, but not if you treat the medium as incidental. Not if you don't think deeply about the changes that have to occur when you're no longer in physical presence with people. And now I can ask a question, which is, I wonder, when we're talking about Lung and being very fast and so forth, I once had the most excruciating Lung that went on and on and on, and he enunciated every word, and he even stopped and said, is that really the right word? And this very brief text took hours and hours of his life and my life. And I wonder, how many people have had that kind of Lung? Okay, it wasn't just me.
Anne, did you want to speak?
I would like to add, because now this, we are in the internet age and this computer age, and I think it is a very, very good thing. I think before, when you used to listen to a lama, a little bit more than like a few hundred, then you couldn't hear him. You could not hear him. You could sit there and just make devotion, but you couldn't hear anything. But now, because of the modern system, everybody can hear everything, and we can also not only Lung, but Chi can be given and is being given through internet and through all sorts of things, and I think it's a very, very good thing. I think it's a and some people, I don't know whether they're receiving Awang or not, but I don't know whether anybody give that so far. But we have been watching His Holiness Dalai Lama's Kalachakra empowerment. I don't know whether we received it or not.
Thinking of what David just said and what difference, thinking about the medium and what might one do differently, maybe particularly in this culture, which tends to be kind of people disembodied, that perhaps reflecting that Lung is actually addressed to an embodied being, usually right in the presence, maybe some cultivation of some kind of somatic awareness, that you're not just watching TV like you always do, but there's actually another somatic being, maybe even just acknowledging those very simple categories would shift it a little bit. And I think it's a very interesting question.
I think also if you've ever watched a really thrilling episode of some TV series, on television, if you really think that can't affect you physically, then I'm sorry for you. Or something really romantic or something really tragic. It's not that different in a way from being in somebody's physical presence.
That's wonderful. And even at some of these big teachings, even though you're in the presence and far back, there might be a screen mediating your experience. So they may not be so different.
I'd like to ask a question about temporal. we've kind of moved around it a lot, this auspicious connection that allows things to happen in certain ways and at certain times. So this is certainly an auspicious connection that's happening. Where did it come from? From maybe, as Bob said last night, from our wishes, from our past lives, from, you know, the light of Paratsana, all the translators' despair and not being able to get together and communicate, and Eric and Andrea's wonderful inspiration, and making it all happen. And for this to be able to continue, I'm, you know, firmly convinced that our present aspirations and this wonderful thing of getting together with the academics and everything has been such an important part. So that was just one question for David, mainly this question about Tyndale, because it also affects the way transmissions happen and the way translations happen. What is the Tyndale that such a student is going to be given, or just chooses such a text to translate at a certain time for a certain audience, or for an academic to decide that this, you know, is going to be his domain of research or translation? And there must be so many causes and conditions that make all this happen and crystallize at a certain time. And why are some translations so incredibly difficult and fraught with obstacles and so on and so forth? And this has to do with the transmission stopping at certain points, or, you know, not doing the proper protector practice for it to be able to happen. And, you know, there may be so many conditions that need fulfilling. So that was one of my questions.
That's probably plenty. Let's have.
Okay.
We just have a few minutes left here.
Well, I'm sure we all think a lot about tendril. That's a beautiful word in Tibetan. And I guess my quick response would be that I've thought a lot the last couple of years about the moments that we participate in and the capacity they have to transform ourselves and others. Because I went through many years of my life just declining to participate. And the last 3 or 4 years, as UVA has embarked on this ambitious effort to contemplativize itself, I was really inspired by the Dean of Nursing, who had this way of just, there'd be a moment, and most of us would just, oh, the moment's passed, maybe it was something that should be said, or inspirational, or correctional, or whatever, and she would just say it every time. And then the whole environment would change. And we all have these moments where we can choose to express our agency as a contribution to the evolving tendril of our lives, or we can let it pass. And over the last couple of years, I've paid a lot more attention to that, a careful attention to people and their bodies and their minds and the words that are said and unsaid, and what I might offer that could move it in a direction of care and wellness and so forth. So that's what I've been thinking these days about tendril.
I think, sorry, I think actually the idea of tendril feeds into my idea, because I've been sitting here and I've been thinking, I don't so much care to think in twos, I prefer to think in threes. And the third, I was thinking, what would be the third element that I would like to add after translation and transmission? I think it's been touched on a lot, but actually transaction. Transaction would be the third thing that I would add, and just to try to be a little disruptive, I hope. And provoke some thought. Why would that might make us uncomfortable, especially to think about economic transactions and donors and support for translations, for example, and how the people who support the translations may actually have a role in shaping the way we translate. And also the question of in-house translations, which hasn't been brought up very much.
Anyone? John, maybe?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what to say, actually. Transaction obviously is an essential part of any sort of relationship. You know, you do that and I'll do this. There's certainly that element in transmission, you know, between the transmitter and the receiver. You don't get, in some sense, you don't get a transmission for nothing. And if you don't put something into it, you don't get anything out of it either. And that's a common paradigm, isn't it? That you know, the more you've made an offering, the more you've kind of gone out of your way even to get to a transmission, then the more it's kind of worth it, because the more you've invested in it. And I think you know, perhaps investment is the key term there. what Dan brought up is very, very wide indeed. So I wouldn't attempt to sort of start talking about the economics of, translation here. But that's a very big topic which we should certainly be discussing. I don't think this is the right forum for it, but just this particular panel. But I think we should keep that somehow for the discussions that are coming up.
Thank you. So we're going to have time for 2 more questions. Since we started 5 minutes late, we're going to end 5 minutes late. So Liz, and then we'll take 1 more question from this side, and that'll be it.
This will be very quick, and it's hearkening back to Anne's quotation of Longchenpa. If great supreme wisdom abides in the body, there's one kind of receptivity and process of transmission we haven't talked about, which is the relationship of the body to itself. And so many of the profound practices that many of us have engaged in the Buddhist tradition are about the body's relationship to the body and the kind of wisdom that arises from that. And how might we discuss that kind of receptivity as something that participates in the process of transmission of knowledge, wisdom, the profound settling into the body by itself, and the cultivation of wisdom that comes out of that. I just wanted to raise that as a topic for discussion in terms of this context of transmission.
Just to acknowledge what you said is so significant. And also, if there were time, one could think about the relationship of the body to itself in the context of the body also always having relationship to its environment and to other bodies, and how are our bodies slightly affected perhaps by the fact that we're surrounded by this beautiful art, for example. It's something, the room would really feel different without, imagine blank walls.
The outside environment,
as well.
If all phenomena are the guru and the body is the guru, we're talking about transmissions happening on multiple dimensions of our being, not only from bodies to bodies, from body to body, from environment to body.
Yeah, beautifully said. And maybe that means that attention to the quality of sound of our work, one of Pound's categories, sound, rhythm, even when it's not, quote, poetry, is something that we want to pay attention to with that in mind.
Elizabeth, you have the last word.
Yes, well, as the last one, I want to return to the title of this panel, which is Authenticity and Transmission. And I think you all addressed transmission, and maybe in that way you were addressing the authenticity of transmission. But often we define things by what they are not. And you only started towards the end to talk about non-transmission, or wrong transmission, maybe was the term you used, but I want to ask about corrupted transmission, and what therefore then constitutes authentic transmission, and how we as translators play a role, and what is our role in authentic transmission. So of course I'm the last one at a time when we actually have to go to lunch. So what I'd just like, if anybody would like to respond to that, would be great. But I'd also like to say, could we bring this topic up again today as we're talking about transmission? What constitutes authenticity?
I think one of the things I wanted to say and didn't really, which was about the perspective from the receiver being different from the perspective of the transmitter. But one of the kind of points of transmission that's important for the receiver is that it's a kind of guarantee of authenticity. Hopefully, the kind of public acknowledgement of a certain teacher's status, and then receiving from that person, in full knowledge of his lineage and everything else, which is again another very important thing that we didn't talk a great deal about, is something that's really important as a kind of measure of authenticity. When you start to talk about inauthenticity, it becomes much more subjective. It becomes much more a question of opinion, and you depend a lot more on other people's opinion and on sort of group community value judgments. And, you know, I'm sure all of us could think of examples of something that we would feel was an inauthentic transmission going on somewhere in the world, but the people who are doing it and receiving it probably think that it's extremely authentic. You know, they may be people doing it, you know, with completely explicit to them false intentions, you know, but probably not so many. But so, you know, I think the traditional Tibetan attitude to those things, and perhaps not just Tibetan, but Asian attitudes to those things, is actually very cautious. You know, we don't have too much denouncing of false transmissions. It goes on, and this is diplomatic. It avoids a lot of conflict within communities or within larger cultural groups. But sometimes, you know, it's frustrating. I think we as Westerners, we think, well, why doesn't somebody say, you know, that this or that Lama is just false, or doesn't know what he's talking about, or has no right to transmit this or that teaching or system. So, you know, I don't claim to have any answers to that. I think I can see the value of the caution and the diplomacy, and very often, you know, there's this Asian way of working around things, and slowly, you know, the problem might subside. I don't know how in Tibet traditionally these things were dealt with. I'm sure it's not just a phenomenon of the modern world that there are false prophets and false transmitters.
I think I would like to say this because I've reflected on this quite a lot. I think that the system the Tibetans kind of adopted is very unorganized. It's not disorganized, it's unorganized. Because, you know, they didn't make a kind of a group or a, you know, agency to check, you know, what's right or what's not right. That's why there's no kind of, everybody can do what they like. You know, it's not, no restrictions. And there is no, like, if somebody is, suppose I am, you know, I'm misbehaving. He's on his Dalai Lama, somebody reports to him, he'll be very sad, but he cannot control me too much. You know? So there is no group or agency like that. And I think there is some good things and bad things too, maybe. The bad thing is that for a while I go, you know, crazy, and then, you know, maybe some people even follow me, you know, if they're stupid. But the good thing is that, you know, there is no kind of group of people who is judging people. And I think it's very, it can become very corrupt after some time. If some people, that's how the communism failed. Because there was some people who has to judge other people, and then they become like, and only people who want to be like that would like to be in that kind of a group, you know. A good Lama will not want to be near it, you know. So therefore, this system has prevented from being, you know, the whole system to be corrupted, although there is scope for lots of, you know, charlatans and others coming in. So now here, in this system, the whole kind of confidence or the trust is given to the people. So they are taught how to, you know, in every teaching there is, you know, how to examine a Lama and how to examine lineage and things like that. So it's up to us, up to the people to examine and to decide. There is no kind of body who will decide. So I think that's I think very important to understand, I think.
And I've seen three types of accusations over the years of corruption in regards to Tibetan Buddhism that I have lots of reservations about. The first one is ethical transgressions. And if we started throwing out all the transmissions by people who are ethically conflicted, I don't know where that leaves us. I mean, I'm from a university by a great person who was ethically very problematic, Thomas Jefferson. So should we throw out the University of Virginia because of that? So I've seen lots of teachers that I did not respect in terms of their ethical integrity, but that doesn't mean they couldn't give great transmissions in certain contexts. Second one would be watered down transmissions. And on this one I heard a lot when I started getting involved with elementary school education. People say, oh my God, what are you doing there? You can't do that. Second grade kids, third grade kids. And my response was, if there's not something profound happening in a second grade classroom with those kids, then I don't know where profundity is. So this whole issue about watered down teachings, I have a lot of reservations about. And the third one I think people accuse is the issue about tradition and innovation. And there I think we can all think of California weekend seminars that we would want to have some serious reservations about. But I think all of us also want to preserve the space for saying, yeah, I've put some time into this and I've got something very different. And I can hear the voice of outrage by Tibetan teachers that I have great respect for, but I simply don't agree.
Well, thank you for ending on such a provocative note that will allow us to have great conversation over lunch. Thank you to our panelists.
Thanks so much. That was really wonderful.